voices were saying, because it appeared that, well, it was clear that when the voices were telling these people to kill themselves, which happens often, the psychiatrists would jump up like stuck pigs and put these guys on suicide watch, fill them full of drugs. I mean, those voices were very real at that point, you know, and they reacted to them as if they were a real threat, and they would drug these people up and lock them up and keep them medicated until they kind of got over wanting to kill themselves. But in all other cases, they ignored what the voices were saying. So it's like, okay, what are these things? You know, they were consistently negative. So to get at that, one of the biggest problems that I faced at the beginning, and it took kind of a few years to kind of figure out how to get over this, what we're dealing with here, and all this information I'm about to give today pertains only to paranoid schizophrenics. There's a lot of different types of schizophrenics. Paranoid schizophrenia is one of the biggest ones. It's one of the ones of most concern. It's one of the ones that results in the most violence. And it's one of the most prevalent ones all over the world. I have statistics somewhere, but in the United States, it's like 10 million people it affects, and their families, which multiplies that out, tremendously. So what these guys experience when they first encounter these voices. Now, what's important to understand is that these voices sound just like their own thoughts. I mean, they don't come through like, oh, yeah, like the Boogie Woogie Man. They sound just like their own thoughts. They hit people mostly who have been physically, sexually, and emotionally severely abused. So they're already depressed. They're already have a negative mindset. They're already transmitting negativity from the traumas that they've faced, and the voices they're like sharks that smell blood. When they detect a big pool of negative emotional energy, they're there to kind of fire it off the best they can. So the individual might be trucking around and going on with their lives, and they stub their toe, and all of a sudden a thought comes into their head that says, well, you stupid bastard, you couldn't even see that thing, you stubbed your toe, and it sounds just like their own thought. And then later on, they might have lost something, and it's like, then that thought comes in, well, you're stupid and you're worthless, and it picks up from there. But it sounds like them talking to themselves. And then it grows in intensity. Now, sometimes they come on and they say, hey, we can help you out. There was one girl that she started hearing, and they said, well, we can help you out on your exams. She was in college. And they told her all the answers to the exams. So she goes, hey, this is cool. So she thought they were her friends until they slowly started turning negative on her. And I got called when her mother saw that she was considering suicide, and the voices were telling him to kill herself. So the voices can come on fast, they can come on slow. Amphetamine is one of the biggest things that brings them about. I mean, amphetamine just opens you up to infestation by these things like nothing else. I've seen more people go psychotic on amphetamines than any other drug. On the other hand, they don't like marijuana because it calms you down, and they will steer you toward those drugs and steer you away from marijuana. I don't know how many times I talked to patients who said the voices didn't want them using marijuana. And I found that interesting. So as these voices increase in intensity, they start increasingly berating the person. And there was one patient I talked to where the voices came in, and it was like they were trying to drive a new car. They would say, hey, go over there and pick up that pencil, or turn around and walk through that door. Or it's kind of like they were trying to see how much the person would listen to what they had to say, how much control they had. It was like they were experimenting with a new vehicle or something, which I found interesting. They don't know which thoughts are theirs and which thoughts are this coming in from the voices. Other than the voices are telling them vile things that they don't want to share with others. They cause constant nightmares and attack these people 3, 4 in the morning. They do not want them to sleep, and that's part of weakening them so they will not resist their suggestions. So they've learned not to talk about the voices. There is no positive benefit for them to talk to anyone about the voices because it's caused them nothing but trouble and heartache, and nobody believes them anyway. They keep the voices to themselves. They isolate themselves because it's easier not to deal with people and try to figure out what's the voices, what's not the voices. And the voices are always telling them negative things about their friends, their family, any close relationship they have, because they want to break them away from those relationships and isolate them. And the patient feels more secure when they're isolated, because then they only have to deal with the voices and they don't have to deal with trying to figure out what's the voices and what's somebody else talking to them, or whether something that other person said was an insult, because these things get them to perceive reality in the worst possible way. It's like they put on, dark sunglasses, and these people are already low on energy and depressed, and so they keep the voices to themselves. It's like a powder keg, and the voices grow stronger while they're in isolation because there's nobody to interfere or give this person support, and they try to drive off anybody who does try to help them and support them, and they do a pretty decent job on that. So this drags along. The voices kind of increase until they figure, well, I'm going to tell the last person in the world that I really trust. So they feel that was a betrayal on the part of their parents, and the voices assure them it was. They go, well, yeah, you can't trust them either. So when they get to the psychiatrist's office, this is what they're told, by an esteemed member of the system. You have a mental illness. The voices you hear are hallucinations. Even though they seem very real to the patient, they're being told they're hallucinations, they're not real. But to the patient, they're very real. And psychiatrists basically tell them nobody else hears these things. So you're the one who's mentally ill, because the rest of us don't hear these things. So they tell them, well, you have a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. This is what they're going to call you. And you're psychotic, and that means you're out of touch with reality as we see it. So here's the patient, goes into the psychiatrist's office, and he's been hit with all this. So they tell him that there is no cure, that they have to take medications and very powerful toxic medications for life, and there is no other treatment. And in their eyes, there isn't. So they go, well, the pharmaceutical industry has come up with some very effective medications that will suppress your voices, but they don't cure anything. They suppress the psychotic symptoms. So the patient's basically forced into taking these mind-numbing antipsychotic drugs with these side effects. Their breasts begin to grow, there's massive weight gain, blood pressure goes all over the place. They have seizures. The blood sugar goes out of control. With long-term use, there's something called tardive dyskinesia that takes place. It's an involuntary jerking of their muscles in their face and their tongue that they can't control at all. It'll spread throughout their entire system, where their hands are shaking, their body's shaking, and if it goes far enough, it lapses into what they called at the state hospital the Thorazine shuffle. How they operated. So to get to the point where I reached these cases where I'm telling you about took years. It took years before they could talk to me and trust me. Because again, even in the prison, I was a watchdog. Sparger was one of the first ones that I started working with in the prison setting, and was willing to tell me everything his voices were telling him in real time, which, like I said, was very rare. When I found one of these guys, and I always had a small group of them available that I was working intensely with, that to me, they were like gold mines. They were like nuggets, diamonds, because most of the inmate population did not want to talk about the voices they were hearing for obvious reasons. Especially to his psych. So what was going on with him? He was a very highly paid stockbroker in New York on Wall Street, making, six-digit. He was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. He was married, and was using a lot of cocaine. And eventually the voices jumped in there while he was using the cocaine and amphetamine, and they got rooted in there. Now, this guy was mild-mannered. He came to a group, so, for a paranoid schizophrenic to go to a group to try to get help was like a non-verbal, like, hey, this guy wants some help, because they get paranoid around all these other people looking at him. So started working with him, and he said after like 15 years, he had hid the voices from his wife for 15 years. And I'm like, how the devil did you do that? And he said the voices were constantly telling him bad things about his wife, this is what they do when the patient has a spouse or a girlfriend or any other relative. They start telling them bad things about them, make them distrust them, and try to break that relationship. So they were constantly telling him bad things about his wife, running her down. And finally, after some 15 years of kind of keeping arm's length from her, she filed a divorce. So he ended up in New York City living out of garbage cans, in some grotto somewhere in Central Park. He slept on newspapers, and the voices liked that, and he did too. He didn't mind it at all. I mean, even though he was freezing, he was in the rain. He said, I always knew which restaurant trash cans to go dig into. It was a very simple life. I was by myself. I didn't have to worry about anything. The voices were keeping me company. I could talk to them. So, it's like, I'm like, why do you want to get rid of them? And he goes, well, I know they're destroying my life. So we worked for months, and what I was doing, basically, this is very simply, is telling him to do the opposite of everything the voices were telling him to do. And kind of try to get him on a positive spiritual path. And as he started working with those things, the voices started losing energy, until they kind of one day, while in my office, they just screamed and disappeared. And I looked at him, and he looked like he was about to fall out of the chair. And he looked at me and he said, the silence is deafening. So this is the first time in decades that the voices have been gone.